Hey, hello, I'm Ren Ribeiro, and I want to connect with you about peace and justice. We are interviewing women who labor for peace, as we have forever and always will, until we all feel peace in our homes, our workplaces, our communities, and especially our bodies and minds. This initiative is named Mujéres Co-Labor for Peace. It's a show of intimate conversations with justice workers who are healing their self and communities from the effects of misogyny, capitalism, and climate change. Welcome to the show. My name is Ren Ribeiro, and I wish you complete wellness and lasting peace. Our guest for episode 17 of Mujéres Co-Labor for Peace is Bitsy Joy Bentley. She and Gail King have been leading an anti-racist embodiment practice that I have relished nearly each week for the past few years. Bitsy is a clay artist in residence at Red Wing Arts and has an inspiring story to tell about their work doing cultural harm reduction. Let's check in with our hearts for a moment. My heart is feeling peaceful and I'm going to say inspired. How is your heart? Let's take a moment to breathe into our hearts and then meet up with Bitsy Joy Bentley. Bitsy! Yay! I got
all the way,
water.
always the way it goes. You got your water?
I got my water. I got everything. Oh my gosh. Well, it is so great to see you outside of our one weekly practice, the anti-racism embodiment practice that you and Gail lead, and to have this one-on-one. It feels really like juicy and wonderful, and special. So I want to say that I am constantly beyond impressed with your insightful and incredibly relevant curation of content every week. And it's been what, like 3 years, more than 3 years that you've been doing this. What we can get into what this is in a minute, but like, and then last week's Friday theme of missing and murdered Indigenous women was just like so incredibly relevant. Thank you. Like, I can't wait to hear about the gathering that you were a part of and kind of all of the threads of your work in cultural harm reduction. Yeah, but one of the things that we do, and you see this little heart this way. Oh, this is my studio image here, is do a heart check-in at the beginning to just be like dropping in and like you teach the embodiment of how are we in this moment? So, like a word, a phrase, a story, or a gesture, like anything that you might want to share about how your heart is in this moment.
Good question. My heart is really excited for this conversation. We don't really get many chances to connect outside of practice, and I'm just really pleased to be here and honored that you asked me to participate. So, yeah, I think I'm feeling, I also was like just out in my garden tending to the hazelnuts and being in nature. So I'm also feeling really full from that too. So that's about where I'm.
Yay. Oh, that's sweet. That's sweet. Ah, yeah, deep breathing. I like pause often in this show to take deep breaths. And for the audio listeners, it's probably really disconcerting and not very exciting, but the content, especially of, healing the effects of misogyny, capitalism, and climate change. They're not lighthearted subjects, and so they require some deep breathing and or just like that check-in, constantly going back, and just like, how am I now? How am I now? Yeah, I'm besides the cold, I'm feeling really excited to have this conversation as well because you do so much good things in the world and I want to hear all about it. Do you want to kick off with any particular thing or do you want me to ask questions?
I like responding to questions. So,
Cool.
yeah, what are you curious about?
Well, yeah, I'd love to start with how was your day of awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women and others?
So it was very interesting, organizing with Native people as a Wasicu, as a white settler, can be really challenging because time is a little bit different, and space is a little bit different, and sometimes the Facebook invitation that you get directs you to a place that is not actually the correct place. So my friend Tasha actually got quite lost. And we wound up, it was a really powerful day altogether beyond the gathering because we went to Fort Snelling, which is the location of a Dakota concentration camp after the war in
Mhm.
1862. And so there was this moment where I was there with my collaborator in the local and native clay work that I'm doing. um, and we're walking around just being creeped out by the grounds and like trying to find the other people that we're meant to be there with. And then eventually it felt very serendipitous to find them walking, on a footpath down into where the state park was, because there's the Fort Snelling site and then there's the Fort Snelling State Park that actually has like a visitor center that has some information and has some stories written by and shared by Dakota culture bearers about the legacy of the concentration camp and the forced removal of
Mm.
Dakota people from Minnesota, from their Makoche or homeland. Um, and so it was also very moving because there was a powwow happening the same day. And powwows are generally more of like a celebratory thing, right? And as I've been doing deeper work with the Mdewakanton Dakota in southern Minnesota and learn more about sort of the cultural significance of the powwow as both a resistance event and also as a tourism thing, where like, you
Mm.
know, there are a lot of different attitudes around that particular kind of celebration. And so we went there and thought that maybe that was where we were headed, but it didn't feel quite right. And so I showed the Facebook invitation to a woman who was giving away swag bags. It was bizarre because like we thought we were going to a missing and murdered Indigenous women's event, and then there was like this inflatable where you could see what polyps look like in your colon and like colon cancer screening and like all of this health stuff,
Oh my
and
God.
then like selling fry bread tacos outside. Like it was really, and it was at the Boy Scout Center, so like everything just felt really off. And then it was really clear, like this is not the event we were headed to. um
Oh my God.
but when we finally did get there, it was really brilliant to be there. The woman who organized it is from Crow Creek, which is a reservation in central South Dakota, and it's actually one of the locations that the Mdewakanton Dakota of southeastern Minnesota were moved to.
Okay.
um and so there's a lot of disconnect there as well around, the stories that are told are not pleasant stories.
Mm.
Um,
Is it lateral violence? Is it pitting one nation against another, or is it more or different?
it's all of the above, and also really deep historical trauma around the Dakota genocide and the execution of the Dakota 38 plus 2 and the forced removal. And so we heard some
By
stories.
Abraham Lincoln, right? Like,
Yeah, Abraham Lincoln is the one who ordered the execution of the Dakota 38 plus 2. And that was in Mankato. There's actually a current issue that's happening. The Minnesota Historical Society is refusing to repatriate a noose that was used to hang one of the Native men that was killed in that execution. And yeah, and they've known about this since 2011. They are denying, so the local indigenous community here, Prairie Island Indian community, which is a federally recognized tribe, um, they put in a request for repatriation of that item to do some healing ceremony, and the Minnesota Historical Society is saying, no, we're not gonna do that, even though it's a violation of NAGPRA,
Right, right.
the Great Repatriation Act. So yeah,
We got to say that one again. I don't think that came through. The
oh,
Native American graves.
NAGPRA, it's Native American Graves. Uh, Hold on a second, I gotta look it up. I know it as NAGPRA, and I always use the
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, it's like because
yeah,
I'm
Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act.
protection.
Um,
Okay.
yeah, and the argument is that because it wasn't in a grave, that it isn't a funerary object or an object that is worthy of, yeah. And it's so typical, really heartbreaking to see.
What's it gonna take? What's it gonna take? It's like, oh, so again, you finally you landed in your space,
Yeah,
the
in the
gathering.
space. It was really lovely. We were there with this woman from Crow Creek and her mother, and the visitor center there had a really great display, and it was really heavy. It's heavy to read these stories, and especially the stories that are being shared from the women and from the grandmothers. And it was about remembering our grandmothers was what the event was about. And I feel very lucky that we were able to go there. And then after the event, Tasha and I walked around in the park a bit and spent some time in nature. And just recognizing that place as a sacred site, and there's a lot of really great work that's Dakota led that's happening in the state of Minnesota right now.
Mhm.
Onwanami Yonami Okodayapi is an organization. It used to be, I believe, the Friends of Phelan Falls. And they're doing a lot of really great things around this sacred site that had actually been dismantled for mining. And then there's also Wakan Tipi, which is, holding stewardship of another sacred site. And there's been a transition in the state of Minnesota in a few of these areas of, white founded and led organizations around nature sites that are starting to transition into Dakota leadership.
Nice.
And so I've been very lucky to be able to hear from a lot of those culture bearers and leaders through uh, presentations from the Honoring Dakota Project, which is something that I'm involved with in Red Wing, Minnesota. So I started driving up once a month from Chicago in order to attend events. And the first phase of the project, it was initiated in the summer of 2020 because there's a real lack of mental health support
Mm.
for Native and Black young people, specifically in Red
Mm.
Wing. And uh, because, Red Wing is named for a Dakota chief.
Mm.
And at the time, there was no representation of Dakota culture or Dakota landscape in Red Wing. Everything is very much around settler colonial aesthetic.
Mm.
And that was established in the 1860s when settlers began uh, settling there. And there's a bluff that overlooks downtown Red Wing called Gemenicha.
Ah,
2014 was actually when the name reclamation happened. The settlers call it Barn Bluff, but the true name is Gemenicha, which means hill, water, wood.
Hill
Um,
water wood.
Hill,
Hill.
water, wood in Dakota. Yeah. Um, and so there's a interpretive center at the base that all it's in Dakota language first, and it's all stories from folks at Prairie Island. There was a name reclamation ceremony that happened, and a lot of work that's happening now around having more Indigenous stewardship of that space. And then, that was a really big thing for the town. There was a lot of like shifting and changing attitudes and behaviors that there's still tension. There's still white settlers that are bummed that the high school students don't paint the bluff every year with their with the year of their graduating class. But by and large, one of the things that's been really hopeful here is that um, the Wasicu, the white settlers of Red Wing, are starting to engage in difficult conversation without being prompted to do so
That's
by Native.
huge. That's
It's
huge.
huge. It's huge. So like last year, the seniors decided to paint the bluff, and it was all on Facebook, and there was a whole thing, and it was actually Wasicu that were saying, hey, no, this is not a thing that we should be doing for these reasons. And Prairie Island didn't have to say anything. And that was a big deal. The fact that the settler community in Red Wing recognized that there's a cultural injury that happened, and that we don't want to perpetuate that cultural injury through this tradition that is, that is decades old, not millennia old.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so how do we call one another in? And so for me, as like a prodigal daughter of this town, it was like, and especially given the cultural harm reduction work that I do, it was like, holy shit, like this is huge, and I feel like I can really play a role here. And so one thing that I did when I came back to town, especially in the context of my clay work that I'm doing, I realized that I needed a community of support around Wasicu harm reduction in town.
Mm.
And so we have a Wasicu cultural harm reduction group that meets every other week. And we've been sort of developing a community of practice similar to our Friday morning practice. But it's a little different because these are like people that I grew up with, so it's a little different.
And it's in person, right?
It's in person, like we're all at Bay Point Park,
Yeah.
by, the place where Dakota women used to go to give birth. And
But he knows a little secret about everybody else.
yeah, exactly. And and it's challenging too in that how do I say this? The Friday morning practice is amazing because it's open to the public and people can pop in and pop out, and but if somebody comes and doesn't have a great experience, it's not like the end of the movement,
Or the
right?
community.
The community,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
it's not as tender as it is when it's like the person who lives across the street, or the
Yeah.
person who like and so there's a certain level of pressure in that work, in navigating it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you had mentioned sort of like the curation. So in the Friday morning practice, typically I'm the one who's bringing the primes together, the things that we respond to, the thing that is meant to provoke a somatic elicitation. And a lot of it really comes from what I'm personally dealing with, quite honestly.
Nice.
A lot of it in the beginning, I had been working with an organization called Stop Online Violence Against Women, researching targeted harassment online
Oh,
directed towards Black women and children. And in the course of that research, sort of looking at like, I had to read the Buffalo Shooters Manifesto for that work.
I
And
remember
so
when we did that. Yeah. Yeah.
and so being able to bring that to that community was a massive support for me to
Nice.
be able to navigate everything that I was experiencing and feeling.
Wow.
Um,
That's great.
because for me it surfaced the eco-fascism that some mass shooters are inspired by, and as a climate justice activist, it was like, well, it was a whole area. And for me, as somebody with Nordic heritage as well, and sort of that relationship in the way that some Nordic theology and Nordic mythology has been appropriated and subverted by eco-fascists, it was incredibly tender and very personal for me. So I'm always deeply grateful honestly for the Friday morning group for the willingness to like go there. You know what I mean? Like,
There's so much magic making going on there. It really, it's transformational. It's certainly iterative as an participant. And so many of us say this is a core piece of my week, of my life, my community building, my practice. It's you and Gail have created something so incredibly beautiful, um, that I wish it was, and it will be, maybe. I want to say it will be, but I have to say maybe, the norm, maybe for my grandson's generation. You
right.
know, a lot of times I hear people say, "Oh, once the white people die off, or the old white people die off, things will be better." It doesn't. It doesn't work
It
that
doesn't
way.
work that way.
Yeah,
It doesn't
because
work that
because
way.
there's cultivation of the next generation to be indoctrinated in these racist and capitalist and misogynistic ways. So that doesn't change with death at all.
And this for me is the reason why practice is so important because my cultural conditioning doesn't stop. It's still there every day, right? Like it's still there every day.
Yeah.
Because the cultural conditioning doesn't stop because it's so ubiquitous, because it's everywhere. It's in our media, it's in
Right.
everything that we consume, it's in the air that we breathe, it's in the water that we
Literally, literally. Yeah.
literally. Well, and it's something that we're even dealing with in the local clay work that I'm doing. So I'm just finishing up a year-long residency at Red Wing Arts Clay and Creative Center. And the thing that I've been questioning as a clay artist is I've been questioning what land back activism looks like in the context of local clay.
Mm-hmm.
Because there is a deep and well-known history. Red Wing is known around the world for its pottery.
Mm.
Uh, and, I went to the Red Wing Pottery Museum when I started my residency and asked about pre-settlement clay practices. What were the clay practices before Europeans came here? And I was told that there weren't any, which we know to be demonstrably false. Like, right? We know that that can't possibly be true. Every single place in the world that doesn't have permafrost has a clay practice.
Oh, okay.
Every single place in the world. And it there
Wow.
was wonderful fiber artist, a Dakota woman named Fern Renville, who came to do a nettle cordage making workshop. And one of the things that she spoke about was the fact that everywhere there is nettle cordage. So everywhere around the world where nettle grows, there is a nettle cordage tradition.
Wow.
Everywhere there is clay around the world, there is a clay tradition.
Wow.
So that kind of universal aspect of it and thinking about it in terms of this cultural injury of just the erasure of Indigenous women's clay craft because it was the women who did this clay craft, Indigenous women's fiber craft because it was the women who did the fiber craft. The fact that there has been this erasure really speaks to, and in our event that Tasha and I led last Thursday, one of the things that we spoke about was the relationship between the erasure and the missing feminine craft traditions and missing and murdered Indigenous women today. That these are of a piece, right? Like there is a relationship between this. It's related and it's
So many threads to weave together and to, kind of do that work that you're doing, the cultural harm reduction. And I love that you name yourself that and do that work. And so many things are coming up in my mind of like, oh yeah, and oh yeah, like yesterday, my daughter and I went to a beautiful reconnecting with the earth retreat from like all day with my grandson. So the three of us, like three generations. It was really sweet. And we had nettle tea and we made teas based on, all the different things that were put out, and we could get a little bit of this, a little bit of that. It was the first time she had made tea that way, and I had no idea. So there's so many things that we don't know that we're passing on or not passing on intentionally. So my question for you on, which may not seem related, is in that museum space, are there any Indigenous people from Mdewakanton Dakota, um, like working together? I used to live in Plymouth, and the Plymouth Patuxet Museum had attempted to bring, an Indigenous voice and a settler voice to the history. Um, not that well, but I'm wondering about the museum in Red Wing.
So the Goodhue County Historical Society has done some work in that area. And they did have people from Prairie Island come in and basically curate a little bit and say, you know what, these things shouldn't be on display and these things need to be repatriated. And so they had that conversation a few years back. It's challenging. So I don't know of any Mdewakanton Dakota that are working with Red Wing Pottery Museum at all. And the items that are on display that refer to Red Wing as being named for Mdewakanton Dakota chief, I can't actually speak to the accuracy of any of those materials that are presented there.
Mm.
Part of the challenge and um, part of the challenge is that the Prairie Island Indian community is small and they are responsible for their community first.
Mhm.
And so, how much bandwidth they have for responding to clueless white people who don't know how to engage in protocol,
Yeah.
who reach out to tribal council to talk about a land acknowledgement when tribal council is trying to make sure that their elders are being fed.
Yeah.
Right? Like and so there is the most tribal communities, as far as I know, and I could be wrong about this because I'm often wrong about things, um,
Yeah.
have a tribal historical preservation office. But even with those groups, a lot of what is being focused on with the TPO offices, and the organizing that's happening there is the situation in Red Wing is that we have a very, very dense concentration of burial mounds in the area that are unknown.
Oh,
Uh, if you know what you're looking for, you'll see them. You'll notice, you'll recognize, but there are cemeteries everywhere
yeah.
around town. And in fact, downtown was built on top of burial mounds. So it's really tricky, right? Because what's the bandwidth, right? And one of the things that I've learned through the Honoring Dakota project and the leadership of people like Jeremy Fields and Collins Provost Fields from Thrive Incorporated, who are Native people who are doing a lot of facilitation for us in that project, is that we move at the speed of relationship.
Mm. Yeah.
Relationship is currency, and relationship takes a very long time to build.
Yeah. I've heard it as move at the speed of trust, which is very, very similar. Yeah.
Very similar, and there have been so many fits and starts of this kind of cultural reconciliation work. So with Honoring Dakota Project, sort of the capstone of the first year was a mural that was
Nice.
designed with input from the Prairie Island Indian community and then presented as a gift in a wopita, which is a Thanksgiving celebration in Dakota culture. So a couple of the things that I worked on, I provided technical guidance for, we had a couple dozen or a few dozen community members working on these mugs in the shape of the state of Minnesota that we printed Minnesota Makoche, which Minnesota is the Dakota term for this land, and Makoche is the Dakota term for homeland. Mini is water, and Sota is, what I've been told is that it is the reflection of the sky on the water.
Beautiful. Oh my gosh.
And so we made these mugs. We made about 100 of them and gave them away to the Prairie Island community, along with some little smudge kits and a few other things, because gifting is a really big part. The Dakota ancestors all lived in really deep communist democracy. And so the disruption of capitalism and colonial capitalism, specifically to the fabric of the land and the fabric of the Oyate, the people, the nation,
You-
has been really the deeper I get into it, before coming back here, I did not know very much. I didn't know about the Dakota genocide. I knew more about the Haudenosaunee Confederacy than I did about the Mdewakanton Dakota before moving back here. And I recognized that it was my own fear and it was my own,
Mm,
um, it hits harder. It's more personal. It's
yeah.
hyper local. I am a third daughter of a third daughter of a third daughter that were all born Catholic settlers on stolen Dakota land. And there's a familial connection in the genocide perpetrated by my ancestors.
Yeah.
Um,
I've
and
been reckoning with that myself. Yeah. Like my ancestors go back to the early 1500s, and the patriarch was the one who led the first Indian War, otherwise known as King Philip's War. And, or not the only one, but one of them. And he founded Concord and Lancaster and all of that, and that's what he's known for. But I went to a talk in Petersham, which supposedly is named after a guy named Peter with a ham, but I don't know if that's true or not. And the indigenous or the she's a white, black, and Nipmuc, the woman who led this presentation, talked about indigeneity and indigenizing oneself as more of a generative and empowering aspiration than decolonizing oneself, which feels like heavy and burdening. And I'm wondering, well, what you think about that, but also what do white people or European Americans identified as white make mistakes around in attempting to understand their indigenous their roots, or learning from Native American culture.
there is a fine line of fuckery between appropriation and appreciation, which is something that I learned from Jennifer Lee Coble, who is a Cree and German woman that I I did a 9-month program that was facilitated by her and another white-bodied woman with Education for Racial Equity. And it's that fine line of fuckery. And I find that the thing that Wasicu or colonizer culture, the common thread that goes throughout is one of extraction. Um, when I have worked with, in my work with Native people, and I'm just beginning, I'm just scratching the surface. I mean, that was the thing that my friend Tasha, who is Sisseton Wapatinoyate, a Dakota woman who was born on the Sisseton Reservation in South Dakota. We're just scratching the surface of the work that we're doing with local clay. The next phase of our work is really interested in kind of going on the road. And the dream is that the we want to bring the Makoche to the people who have been exiled from it.
That's beautiful.
Uh,
May you win many, many grants to do this work. Big
well,
one.
and that's a part of it, right? Is the extraction piece of it is that I am interested in centering the reconnection and engage in a recognition of the deep trauma that can be associated with the land, and how do we, as clay artists that are interested in working with hyperlocal materials in order to avoid extractive industry, right? Like a lot of it comes from a desire to engage in more sustainable practices in clay, because so many of the materials that we work with come out of these enormous mines. It's actually the clay that we work with is a byproduct of the industrial ceramics industry. And so there's sort of this desire to go hyper local and to have a deeper relationship with the land. But if we don't do that within context, we have the capability of causing further harm.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there is an opportunity for reconciliation in that work. And I think that some of the mistakes that white people, that Wasicu, that colonizers, that settlers do is we try to move too fast. The urgency and the expectation of comfort in particular, I think, are a couple of our conditioned tendencies that really get us into trouble when seeking to build relationship. The other thing that I think is really profound that I find myself considering quite a bit is this extractive, one of the things that my collaborator Tasha speaks to in her artist statement is, her exploration of her culture in her artwork, that she wants to encourage other people to explore their culture. And I recognize that for myself, I'm finding a curiosity about the Celtic and Nordic clay traditions that I maybe don't know about.
Yeah.
Right.
Renee and I actually are doing every single week. We still meet to talk about indigenizing ourselves. We're kind of from the same area in Western Mass or ish, close enough to drive. And it's really a lovely practice. And we similarly feel like we're just scratching the surface. We're just getting started, and it will take generations, but we have to keep on keeping on doing that work. And I want to.
The work of decolonization and re-indigenization,
Yes.
just to loop back to that, I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both.
Okay. Yeah, that makes so much sense.
Right? It's a both. I have to find ways of doing less harm, and I'll have to find my indigenous roots.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah. I find myself wanting to just like soak in the truth of anything an indigenous person who has really done that work says. And I'm going to be going this week to the Transforming the Culture of Power that Visioning Bear Circle Intertribal Coalition puts on each year. And that's a really brilliant thing to close on of, both and just embody your own truth and and be open. Yeah. I am Ren Ribeiro, and I thank you for joining. This initiative is named Mujéres Co-Labor for Peace. It's a show of intimate conversations with justice workers who are healing their self and communities from the effects of misogyny, capitalism, and climate change. This initiative is supported by Inner Fortune, the full-life self-coaching journal that is now digital. Join us for peace, and thank you for your heart.